Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our inaugural video streaming event from the Waterville Historical Society. We are thrilled to be back, and we're so glad that you're joining us this evening for our first presentation. And I'd like to introduce to you Abby Pearson. Abby is on the staff at Colby College, and the topic tonight is Mayflower Hill and the surrounding area. And we'll hear about the landscape from long ago to the present time. Abby is a 10th generation Mainer.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
and grew up in Bath.
I live in Bath now, and I grew up in Yarmouth.
Yep. And went to USM and studied biology. And so we're thrilled to have her tonight, and I will get right out of the way and turn things over to her. And thank you so much for watching tonight. Abby.
Great, thank you. And I'm really excited to share this with all of you. I'm really looking forward to hearing input from you community members. I'm sure that many of you have stories to tell about this land that is now used by Colby College. And I welcome any contact, emails, any questions that you all have or stories that you want to share. I'd really like to hear those. So I'm going to start now with my presentation, and I'm really talking just about the land use history, basically from 1800 forward. And I don't have information from before that time period yet. I'm hoping to learn more about that at some point in the future. A lot of my interest in this land use history was inspired by Tom Wessels, who is a faculty at Antioch University. He grew up in Vermont. He wrote a wonderful book called Reading the Forested Landscape, and it gives you a great guide to the landscape cues that you might see in New England when you walk around in our forests. And these slides will be available to you later, but there are many videos on YouTube where you can see him standing in a forest and talking about the land around him. And I highly recommend this book and other books by him. So a really broad overview of some of the landscape changes that we've seen in Maine. Of course, series of fires, and some of the biggest years of fires were 1825, and a lot of people know about the 1947 fires, and particularly their impact on Mount Desert Island. But those fires were actually broad spread across a lot of Maine that year. Just a bad combination of dry forests. European settlements, of course, in the mid-1700s mostly, they were a little bit before then, led to a lot of forest clearing. And one of the most influential events that took place in Maine's history was a huge surge in wool production all across New England, mainly between 1800 and 1850. And so this has been referred to as sheep mania. A series of restrictions on trade of wool from Europe led to many New Englanders raising sheep for wool. And just as fast as that trend started, it also fell with increased railroads that brought farmers to deeper soils and less rocky soils in the Midwest. And also the invention of barbed wire really changed the rock walls that had been built primarily during that time from about 1820s to 1870s, because you no longer needed to stack huge piles of rocks to hold in your sheep. You could use barbed wire instead. Paper making led to another round of clearing after the first round of clearing from the European settlers. Rise in industry following the Civil War, railroads all changed our landscape and changed the way that we use our New England landscape. Second growth cuts, in some cases third growth cuts in the early 1900s. And by the late 1900s, most of the state is forested. 90% of the landscape in Maine is forested, but most of that forest is very young relatively, and almost all of it is impacted by logging. So if you take a walk on Mayflower Hill, or really anywhere in New England, you will see several of these clues. You'll see rock walls, mostly that were built between early 1800s and the mid 1800s. You'll see legacy apple trees, and this is true all across Mayflower Hill. You'll see some really old apple trees that actually still bear tasty fruit as long as you get some that don't have worms. And you'll see these abrupt changes in the composition of the forest. So in this picture that I've shown here, you see hemlock forests on one side and you see beech maple forests on the other side. And the soil doesn't really change in that spot. It's kind of a level spot with the same soil, but one side was cleared and one side was allowed to grow for quite a long time before that. We also see things like upturned roots that lead to pits and valleys, so changes in the topography of the landscape. In a natural forest, this is what you see. And what you want to see is trees will fall down over time, new trees will grow, and as those trees fall down, they create pits where the roots were, and then mounds where the roots decompose and where they displace the soil. And we can see that in our landscape with these pits and valleys. In other places, you'll have really even flat soil, and you can tell that it was either plowed or grazed or both. This is a section of the Colby Forest near where the Beaver Dam is, and I've pointed out some lines here to help you see what's going on. So this is an old roadbed. You can see the sides slope down and then go horizontal for a while and then slope back up the other way. So this is one of the roads that crossed what is Mayflower Hill, what is now the Colby campus, and we'll see evidence of this later, but these are clues that you can see in there that help you figure out how the land was used in the past. So if we look at the Colby campus from above, we can see other clues. Foundations, there are several that are pretty obvious, and the clearest one is over by Johnson Pond. Rock walls all across the campus. The old roadbed, which shows up in this map in this line of forest right along here, and the arrow points to somewhere pretty close to where that other photo of the roadbed was. Farm junk, as I like to call it, just old pieces of farm equipment, barrels, tons of glass bottles from dairies. We see sugar maples that were planted, Concord grapes that still bear great fruit, apple trees that still have some good fruit as well. And so these can all tell you something about how that land was used in the past. So let's go back in time and see what we do know. The Colby Archives have some great aerial photography that I use throughout this presentation. This image here actually comes from Google Earth in an old image from 1997. And throughout these pictures, I'm going to try to keep you oriented by showing you where Miller, the library, is and where the chapel is, and Mayflower Hill Drive. So we're starting in 1997 and we're going to go back from there. Keep an eye on this section of forest that surrounds the top of Runnels Hill, and also this section of forest which covers most of what we now call the Arboretum. So going back 27 years, we're in the 1970s-ish. You can see Mayflower Hill, the chapel, and Miller Library again. I've pointed out some apple trees here. Those are apple trees that we'll see throughout this presentation as we go back in time to the farms that were on this land before Colby. You can see in the section that we call the Arboretum now that there's an open canopy. This is a very young forest with some trees, a lot of shrubs, and plenty of sunshine getting through. Go back even further into the early 1960s. Again, we're kind of in the same viewpoint here. You can see that I-95 is present in this picture, and it will be gone in the next picture. You can still see this row of trees here, which indicates where that old road bed used to be, and we'll get a better image of that later on. You can see the apple trees are still there. This section of forest in the Arboretum is not really forest at all. It's just an old field with some shrubs. So now we're tilting our view up a little bit and looking straight down at the campus, again with Mayflower Hill Drive, the chapel, and Miller, you can see at the top of Runnels Hill a little neat little orchard with all their little lines and grids of the apple trees. So this is from 1955. Also, take a look at this section down here that we call the Arboretum. That's basically all just field. There's probably a few little shrubs, but it's basically just field. And you can start to see the edges of property where you have these lines where rock walls are still actually there, but where they were placed to delineate the lines for the farmers that own that land. Again, this area that I've just highlighted in green is all now forest. The orchard doesn't exist at all anymore. There's hardly any evidence of that orchard up there anymore. And the whole section that I've marked below, that is green, is now what we call the Arboretum. Okay, so going back in time a little bit further, this is the 1940s. Again, we have Miller and the chapel. I-95 has not been built yet. You can see Mayflower Hill Drive, and this is a relatively young campus. So the campus was downtown Waterville, as I'm sure many of you know. And the land was purchased to move Colby to Mayflower Hill in 1931. And so over the next decade or so, there was a lot of construction to move the campus up onto the hill. A lot of the buildings are missing there. This section that I've highlighted in green here, this is an old roadbed, the one that I have referred to several times here. And this other line in green is another road that was called Maple, I'm having a moment. I can't think of what it was. We'll get to it though. I've got it labeled in another spot. This is a little bit earlier. You can see that Miller Library is still under construction. Roberts is under construction. The chapel is finished because it was the first building constructed. And 1940, so just a little less than a decade after the land was built, you can see the chapel, you can see Miller. There's very little forest on the land that's now owned by Colby. This line that I've drawn across the map here is how you used to access Mayflower Hill Drive. And I've also pointed out a section of forest that's called Beefsteak Grove. And I've seen this written in a few bits of research that other people have done in the past on Mayflower Hill Drive, and I've not yet seen a good explanation for why it's called Beefsteak Grove, but keep an eye on it because it will help keep us oriented when we're looking at other images of the hill. This is 1938, so the very first building, the chapel, is mostly constructed here. There's one building left on the campus here called the Stanley House, so the Stanley family. They kept that house on campus for as long as they could so that the people that were doing the construction had a place to use for breaks and such, food. You can see that it's almost covered up by Miller Foundation here, and it doesn't take long before it gets swallowed up by the campus. This is a groundbreaking party in 1937, and this is that same house, the Stanley House. You can see the big elm tree next to the Stanley House, which of course we know there aren't many of those left. And if we go back even further, this is the early 1930s, before we had begun any construction up here. And I suspect that this was just before or just around the time that Colby purchased the property from the farmers that lived there. So if we stand below and look up at Mayflower Hill, kind of facing north-northwest-ish, we can see a line of trees and shrubs where the stream, the Perkins Stream, crosses the campus. We can also see some, we can also see some orchards. There's some little rows of trees here, and then at the very top of the hill here. And you can also see that there's farmhouses along this route too. So we know something about the families that lived up here, and I know that some of you know something about the families that lived up here because you probably are in one of those families. And many of those families have gravestones in the cemeteries in Waterville. I came across, so while I was pondering what was happening in the forest, as I walked through the forest and thought back on the guidance from Tom Wessels, I then found this map, which actually shows the property boundaries of the farmers that own the land, and it is overlaid by building plans. Of course, this plan of Colby campus didn't actually get built exactly as drawn here. You can see a big building over on the right, my right, I think it's on your right too, of an athletic center that was not actually built there. And you see this little cluster of buildings over here that was meant to be faculty housing, and that never happened either. You can even see a little patch of forest here, and in really fine print it says Beefsteak Grove. So here's another marker of that strangely named chunk of forest. On the left, I have a list of family names that are on this map, and some of them are a little hard to read, and I may not have spelled them correctly because of that, but this is most of the families that owned the land that was later purchased by Colby. You can also see up above that there's a stream going across where Johnson Pond is now. Johnson Pond was constructed based on the stream that was over that property. They just dug it out and thought that it would be a beautiful spot for a little pond. So this is currently what the roads look like if you ignore the buildings in those little campus drives. We have Mayflower Hill Drive that circles along in the bottom of this picture. We have Campus Avenue that circles around the outside of campus by the athletic center, and Johnson Pond. And so if we go back and look at what this looked like before we built this campus, starting in 1931, I've overlaid the old roads that cross the campus. So Western Ave crossed, this is the road that I've mentioned several times in this talk, that crossed right across, almost through Miller, across Johnson Pond, and connected up with Second Range Way. Second Range Way does not actually exist as Second Range Way now because it was then intersected with I-95 and renamed Washington Street. We can see the streams. The biggest stream on the bottom right is Messalonsky Stream, and Perkins Stream goes across to the left. We have Maple Court, which was the name of the road that I couldn't think of before. And I've marked some of the property names here: Page, Poulin, Morrill. Morrill gets spelled differently across many different documents over time. Stanley, Eustis, and of course these properties change hands between families, and that evolves over time as well.
I have two questions.
Oh, we have a question. Two questions.
Yep. First one was they thought that the land was donated to Colby.
So I've seen conflicting reports about that, but I do know that some was purchased because I've seen deeds of that. But I'm guessing that somebody knows much better than I do about that.
And do you know why the pond was named Johnson Pond?
I don't. That's a great question.
And then why Mayflower Hill?
Again, I don't know. I would love to hear if somebody knows. I'm not sure how that came to be.
Okay.
So if we look at this map, we can get some more clues about what was there before we purchased the property. We know that there were some small woodlots over by the Page property, the Beefsteak Grove section, some over towards the Stanley property, over down where the railroad was, and some of the oldest forest, which is along Perkins Stream in what is now the Arboretum, where there's a pretty impressive stand of hemlocks and old pines. We also know about some of the houses that were along these old roads. We can see the old rock walls as they're marked on this map, but also we can see them on campus as well still. We know that certain areas were used as pasture land. Some of that was for sheep, some also for cattle, other creatures. We know that there were several apple orchards on campus. I think most of them were fairly small, but certainly beyond which a family would use just themselves. They certainly sold some during that time. And actually we have some of the agricultural census records that I'll get to in a little bit later. So this is April 1931. I suspect that this picture was taken maybe as part of Colby College's survey of the land and deciding to move up onto Mayflower Hill. You can see Beefsteak Grove there. That's the big pile of pines. And I'm going to continue marking that just so you can kind of keep yourself oriented with this arrow here. You can see there's several farmhouses in this picture. And here I've marked again, the black arrow points to Beefsteak Grove, that old pines. Up where it says Runnels Hill on this picture, you can see some orchards right at the top of the hill, more orchards down below. There is some work that shows that perhaps the lineup of these farmhouses are Poulin property, Page property, and Morrill properties. And we can see that they certainly had some cows around. So around 1930, this is my best estimate of some of the families and where their houses were placed on the campus. So Western Ave crossed what is now the campus instead of Mayflower Hill Drive, which hadn't been constructed yet, Maple Court, and there are houses along each of these, and also indication that there was a schoolhouse just below where Johnson Pond is now. And we even have some information about the families that lived there themselves, and I'm hoping that some of you have even more information. So this is only just a couple of the residents that lived up here in 1930, according to the census. And the image on the right here, where you can see LaPointe, Poulin, Libby, these are all taken directly from a 1930 census document. And I'll talk a little bit about how you can find those documents yourself. So for instance, the LaPointes lived on Western Ave. There was Wilfred and Elise. They had 9 kids. They were married at ages 24 and 16. Elise speaks French, as did many of the families that lived up on Mayflower Hill. There was a lot of French-Canadian families living there. We can see that LaPointe was a farmer and had in the past worked as a pulpwood lumberman. And I can't remember if I could see that on this census, or I think it was more likely that I could see that in a previous census. Poulin, who owned what is now the Hill House, lived on Western Ave, and you'll notice, if you're familiar, that should sound a little interesting because the Hill House is no longer where Western Ave once crossed campus. The Hill House was taken from basically where the president's house is now, down Maple Court to the end of it, and they moved the whole house down that road. So the Hill House, even though it was owned by Poulin, it was in a different location when Poulin owned it. There's a whole series of members of the Poulin family over time. You can see that this family had 6 kids. I suspect that some were from a previous marriage based on, one, Lizzie's age, but also some differences in the census over time. And we could also see that they had French-Canadian heritage. So this is a similar map to what I showed you before, but with updated families going back even further into the past in 1850. Morrills, there were several Morrill families, members of the Morrills family. They were several brothers that owned property, or sometimes a father and sons. Of course, everything was listed under the men's name then. Clifford's, Page, McKechnie, that foundation still exists. It, of course, changed families since the 1850s, and that house actually burned down several times, and they rebuilt it, and then finally it just burned down and it was left as a foundation. And if you saw the article in the Colby magazine, when I'm standing in a foundation, that's where I'm standing. So we have farm records from the 1850s, not just about the families that lived there, but there's agricultural census records as well. And we can see that the McKechnie family produced, had 80 acres. They had potatoes, apples, butter, and cheese that they would sell. Their house burnt down several times. You can see the Morrills, well, one member of the Morrill family owned 57 acres and produced oats, wool, apples, and so on with Haynes and Page. And you can see a pattern here of apples, wool from all the sheep, because this is kind of at the end of the sheep mania period. Oats were a major grain that they would grow then instead of necessarily wheat or hay. And here's a map from 1879, and the green box roughly shows the edges of what is now the Colby campus. And I'm sure that it is hard for you to read these from looking on your computer right now, but you can see that there's several Morrill families, Page, Clifford, in that area. And here I've just highlighted those two roads again that cross that area. And then going back even further, this is the 1856. Again, the green square denotes the property that is now Colby property. And we see the families McKechnie, Morrill, Clifford, Page, Tozier, and others. And what we see in this time for changes in agricultural, or what we see in the agricultural records for Mayflower Hill, reflect well in what we saw broadly in Maine for agricultural trends between, say, the 1900s and 2002. So we can see that during that period from 1900 to 2002, we see these big increases in production of barley, potato, and apples, big decreases in production of cows, milk cows, sheep, and wool, many fewer farms and much fewer acres of farmland, even though the population increased dramatically during that time. So what we can see is that there are fewer farms. They were producing different products in 2000 versus 1900. None of that is a surprise. And what this leads us to believe is because the population is increasing, it's very clear that we're getting our goods from outside the state of Maine and, of course, outside the US broadly. So where does this bring me now? I would love to learn more about the pre-1800 land use history. It's much harder to find those documents. And I'm especially interested in learning some of the Wabanaki history of the way that they used this land over time. I'm very interested in hearing stories from local families. I'm interested in learning about some of the glacial and geological influences of Mayflower Hill as well, because that is not my background. And I'm sure that some of you will be interested in where you can learn more if you want to look into this in different places in the state. Many of the images that I show in my presentation came from the special collections in Colby. We have census records. Some of those are free through Family Search, which is an online source, or through the Ancestry Library. You can either access through Colby or as a member, but that is a paid membership. And then the agricultural census records, which are also called non-population schedules, are available from 1850 to about 1880. You can access those through the Ancestry Library, either as a member or through Colby Access, but you can also find them through the USDA Census of Agriculture. And these are my acknowledgements of most of what I'm bringing up here is not new information. This is me kind of bringing up work that other people have done in the past. And Charles Ferguson has reached out to me recently too. Thank you for that. But it's all history, it's all there. I just kind of dug some of it up again. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so we had one person respond to the Johnson Pond.
Oh, great.
Johnson was a past president,
Okay, that makes sense.
retired in 42, and they dedicated the pond to him.
Oh, that's great. Well, that makes sense with the timing of when Johnson Pond would have been constructed.
So, and then the general consensus is that the city bought a good chunk of the land and donated it. So they probably bought other pieces after that starting point.
I do know that there was a lot of controversy about where Colby would go, and a lot of people wanted Colby to stay in Waterville, and other people wanted Colby to move elsewhere, and I suspect that some of that was an incentive to keep Colby in Waterville.
Then I had another comment by Paula Raymond. It's interesting to note that French Canadians were the first to develop those parts of the hill. We don't hear of that very often. Usually the French Canadian culture is head of falls or down in the plains.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
Yeah.
So as somebody who has not grown up in the Waterville area, I don't think I have a good preconception of which areas are known more as French Canadian. But certainly within this time period, the mid to late 1800s, early 1900s, it was a lot of French Canadian families, yeah.
And then Elizabeth said through Wikipedia, God bless Wikipedia,
Yes, absolutely.
joint effort between Waterville citizens and the college raised more than $100,000 to purchase 600 acres.
Great.
So it sounds like it might have been a joint effort. So.
Yeah, there certainly was money that went to some of the families up here. Whether it was market price or not, I'm not sure. And how much was contributed by others versus Colby, I'm not sure either. But that's great, that's helpful.
And then Bob Nelson commented and said,
Hi, Bob.
what was excavated from Johnson Pond was used to construct the terrace that led down the slope in front of Miller Library.
Thank you. My students asked me about that the other day. How was that terrace built? And I said, I suspect that since they would have had to dig out a whole lot of soil to build Johnson Pond, that's where it came from. And thank you, Bob. And I'm very proud of myself that I figured that one out.
There you go.
I'm glad it's confirmed.
Excellent. Well, if anybody wants personal copies of Abby's slides, send an email to the Historical Society. So info@watervillehistoricalsociety.com, .org, sorry. Are there any other questions before we sign off? And I'm not seeing any.
Okay. Well, if any of you have any questions later on, feel free to send me an email. I'll make sure that is available. You can always look me up on the Colby directory as well.
Okay, guys, and for those of you that don't know, me, the person asking the questions, is Brian. I forgot to tell you that, and I thank you all for joining us. And we are going to have another talk in the next month, so be looking for that information. Thank you, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you all.